July 2, 2009. Wabash County, Indiana. A truck speeds down a rural highway, a man's voice cracking into a phone pressed against his ear. "She's not breathing. I'm bringing her to you. I'm bringing her to you right now." Inside the cab is Scott Pattison. In the seat beside him, his wife, Lisa, motionless. He tells the 911 dispatcher he found her trapped beneath the barbell of their home weight bench, pinned across the throat, her face purple. He says there was no time to wait for an ambulance, so he picked her up himself and got in the truck. Before the truck, before the 911 call, before any of it, there was simply Lisa. Lisa Pattison, 36 years old, lived a life that looked, by every outward measure, like one she had worked hard to build. In the small community of LaFontaine, Indiana, tucked into Wabash County, she was known as a marketing manager, sharp, creative, and driven in a career she had clearly put years into shaping. But to those closest to her, Lisa wasn't defined by her job title. She was a mother first. Her son, Dylan McCoy, was weeks away from turning 18, on the edge of adulthood, with his mother still very much guiding him there. Family remembered Lisa as someone who carried herself with optimism. Friends described her as warm, animated, the kind of person who filled a room, and when she married Scott Pattison, it had the feel of something out of a storybook. She arrived at her own wedding in a horse-drawn white carriage. Scott, in a tribute to her favorite tale, wore a beast costume so he could dance with his bride, his beauty. It was the kind of image people don't forget. A young couple, clearly in love, starting a life together. What no one watching that wedding could have known was how far that image would eventually drift from the truth. Lisa was building a future, for her son, for her career, for the family she believed she had. She had no reason to suspect that the man she married, the man in the beast costume, would one day be the reason her future ended. To everyone around them, Scott Pattison was an easy man to like. He ran his own roofing business, built a reputation as a hard worker, a provider. He was the husband who dressed as the beast for his own wedding. A man, by all appearances, devoted to his wife. That was the version of Scott Pattison that LaFontaine, Indiana knew. But behind the closed doors of that household, a different picture was forming. About 6 months before Lisa died, police were called out to the Pattison home for a domestic dispute. It was logged as verbal, no charges, no arrests. The kind of incident that, on paper, might look minor, but it was a crack in the image. A sign that something inside that marriage was not what it appeared to be from the outside. Lisa, it turned out, had her own suspicions. A friend later told investigators that months earlier, Lisa had quietly installed internet tracking software on Scott's computer. She wanted to know who he was talking to, what he was hiding. That software, the friend said, was still running as recently as January of 2009, 6 months before Lisa's death. And then there was something far older, a report from 2001, 8 years before, sitting in the files of the Wabash County Sheriff's Department. A tip, never substantiated at the time, that Scott Pattison had once asked someone to kill his wife. What Lisa didn't know, what investigators wouldn't learn until much later, was that Scott was involved with another woman. Her name was Stacy Henderson. And while Lisa was raising their son and suspecting infidelity, Scott was already building a second life. On the surface, this was a marriage that still looked salvageable, a wedding photo on the wall, a family routine that carried on, but underneath it, something had been rotting for years. In March of 2009, the cracks in the Pattison marriage became official. Scott filed for divorce. For a moment, it seemed the marriage was simply ending the way so many do. Papers filed, a separation underway. But 2 months later, in May, Scott reversed course. He filed a continuance, asking the court to pause the proceedings. The reason given: he and Lisa were trying to reconcile. And on the surface, that's exactly what it looked like. Scott and Lisa kept living together. Their son Dylan, still under the same roof. Their house was put on the market. A couple, it seemed, restructuring their life together rather than tearing it apart. But reconciliation requires honesty, and Scott wasn't offering any. Even as the divorce sat paused in the eyes of the court, even as he and Lisa shared a home, Scott was still in contact with Stacy Henderson. The affair hadn't ended. If anything, it continued running quietly in parallel with a marriage everyone believed was being repaired. By the summer of 2009, Scott Pattison was a man pulled in 3 directions at once. A wife he had legally tried to leave, then publicly tried to stay with. A mistress he hadn't given up. and, investigators would later come to believe, a wife who may have begun piecing together exactly what was going on. July 2nd, 2009. According to Scott Pattison, the day began before sunrise. He told Detective Mike Davis that he woke before 5 a.m., kissed Lisa goodbye, and drove to the landfill to start his workday. By 6:30 a.m., he said, he was back home, just long enough to pick up his son, Dylan, and an employee, before heading out to a roofing job. Then, he claimed, the morning became routine. Errands. Work. Time away from the house. He told investigators he didn't return home again until around 11:30 a.m., walking through the door at roughly 11:45. That's when, according to Scott, he found Lisa on the weight bench in their home fitness room. The barbell pinned across her throat, her face, in his words, purple. Totally purple. He said he tried CPR. When that failed, he didn't wait. He carried her to his truck and called 911, racing toward Marion General Hospital with his wife dying beside him. This was the story. A husband, gone most of the morning, who came home to a nightmare. At 12:14 p.m., the call comes in. Scott Pattison, his voice frantic, tells the dispatcher his wife isn't breathing. He's not waiting at the house for an ambulance. He's already in his truck, already moving, and he's asking for a police escort to clear his path to the hospital. Within minutes, an ambulance and a police officer intercept him on the road. Paramedics take over, transferring Lisa from Scott's truck into their care, racing the rest of the way to Marion General Hospital. It isn't enough. Lisa Pattison is pronounced dead on arrival. Back at the house, crime scene investigators move through the home fitness room where Scott said he found her. They document a bruise across her neck, an abrasion on her shoulder. On its face, the scene tells a simple story. A home gym, a heavy barbell, a tragic accident waiting to happen in thousands of houses just like this one. But even in those first hours, something didn't sit right with investigators in the small Wabash County department. A man finds his wife trapped beneath a barbell, not breathing, face turning purple, and instead of staying on the line with 911, instead of waiting the few critical minutes for paramedics trained to handle exactly this kind of emergency, he puts her in his truck and starts driving. It was the kind of decision that, under scrutiny, raised more questions than it answered. For the community of LaFontaine, none of that scrutiny had reached them yet. What they heard was simple, devastating news. A young mother, a wife, gone in an instant, the victim of a freak accident in her own home. Neighbors grieved, friends mourned. No one yet imagined they were looking at anything other than a tragedy. That would not last. Investigators went back to the one piece of evidence that started it all, the Smith machine. The equipment was designed with safety stoppers, built specifically to catch the barbell before it could descend far enough to harm someone. When investigators examined the machine, those stoppers weren't in place. On the surface, that detail seemed to support Scott's story, a missing safeguard, an accident waiting to happen. But when investigators tested the bench themselves, the accident theory began to fall apart. Even without those safety stoppers, Lisa should have been physically capable of wiggling free from beneath the bar. A trapped woman, conscious and struggling, had a way out. The freak accident investigators had first considered no longer matched the physical reality of the equipment. The autopsy made the picture even harder to reconcile with Scott's account. The coroner determined Lisa's death was caused by asphyxia, not from a sudden violent blow, the kind you'd expect from a heavy bar dropping at speed and crushing down on her throat. Instead, the compression had been slow. Sustained. The medical examiner also documented something else. Petechiae, tiny burst blood vessels, scattered not just on her neck, but along her back and waist, the kind of marking forensic pathologists associate with strangulation, with restraint, with another person's hands. As detectives widened their search, they pulled an old file out of storage, a report from 2001, nearly a decade old, alleging that Scott Pattison had once asked someone to kill his wife. On its own, too old, too uncorroborated to build a case around. But placed next to everything else now surfacing, it was impossible to ignore. Then, in mid-July of 2009, the case turned. An employee from Corson, the company that had installed Scott's home surveillance system, placed a call to police. Scott, the employee said, had asked an unusual, oddly specific technical question about how the system worked. It was enough to raise a flag, and it revealed something investigators hadn't fully understood until that moment. The system recorded directly to an internal hard drive. Detectives had already looked at that unit once. They'd found no footage on it. That single tip, a strange question, asked at the wrong time, to the wrong person, gave investigators what they needed. They went back to court, seeking a search warrant for the surveillance system itself, certain now that whatever had really happened inside that house on July 2nd was hidden somewhere on that hard drive. With the warrant in hand, detectives seized Scott Pattison's surveillance system and pulled the recording from July 2nd, 2009, directly off the internal hard drive. What they found on that footage didn't just contradict Scott's story, it dismantled it. The timestamps showed Scott returning home at 8:32 that morning, not 11:30, as he'd told Detective Davis, and he hadn't simply gone inside and stayed there. The cameras had captured him moving in and out of the house repeatedly across the late morning, exactly as the earlier footage review had suggested. Every version of the timeline Scott had given investigators was now sitting beside hard, time-stamped video proving it false. Wabash County prosecutor Bill Hartley would later describe that moment, watching the footage for the first time, as the turning point. The moment the case shifted from a circumstantial theory into something the state could actually take in front of a jury. And the video wasn't standing alone. Investigators laid it next to the phone records, the more than 100 text messages exchanged between Scott and Stacey Henderson, sent and received during the exact window he claimed to be desperately driving his dying wife to the hospital. Put together, there was no version of Scott Pattison's story left intact. Not where he said he was, not who he said he was with, not what he said he was doing during the hours that mattered most. Investigators were no longer looking at a grieving husband with an unfortunate gap in his memory. They were looking at a man who had built an entire account of that morning on a foundation of lies, and who hadn't realized that his own home security system had been quietly recording the truth the whole time. In September of 2009, a Wabash County grand jury made its decision. Scott Pattison was indicted for the murder of his wife. He was arrested at his mother's house and taken into custody. The same man who, months earlier, had been a grieving widower receiving condolences from his community. The trial began in late October of 2010. Prosecutors built their case methodically, walking the jury through the same evidence that had broken the case open, the surveillance footage, the timeline that didn't add up, the hours Scott had lied about. They even brought the actual weight bench into the courtroom, setting it in front of the jury so they could see, for themselves, the equipment at the center of it all. The defense pushed back. They pointed to a toxicology report showing Lisa had a diet drug in her system at roughly 3 times the therapeutic dose, a drug known to cause fainting spells and irregular heartbeat. Their theory, Lisa could have collapsed onto the bar herself, alone during a workout. A defense medical witness went further, testifying that if Scott had deliberately pressed the bar down on her throat, the injuries should have been more severe. A fractured larynx, more significant trauma than what was found. It wasn't enough. The jury weighed the defense's theory against the timeline evidence and the surveillance footage, and the footage won out. During deliberations, jurors reportedly recreated the scenario themselves using the weight bench, testing for themselves whether Scott's account held up. It didn't. Scott Pattison was found guilty of murder. On December 3, 2010, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. The judge did not hold back in his characterization of the man standing before him. Stacey Henderson, the mistress whose name had surfaced again and again throughout the investigation, faced consequences of her own. She was later charged after lying under oath about how she'd obtained inside information on the case, and ultimately reached a plea deal. Scott Pattison didn't stop fighting. He appealed his conviction, arguing the search warrant used to seize his surveillance footage lacked probable cause, that the very evidence that convicted him should never have been allowed. The Indiana Court of Appeals disagreed. His conviction stood. The footage, the court ruled, had been lawfully obtained and lawfully used to put him away. In the end, this case is about an illusion, a white carriage, a beast costume worn for love, a wedding that looked, to everyone watching, like the beginning of a fairy tale. What that day actually concealed was years of dishonesty, an ongoing affair, and a marriage that was, underneath it all, heading toward violence. It's also, in its own way, a case about technology turning against the man who trusted it most. Scott Pattison installed that surveillance system to protect his home. Instead, it became the single piece of evidence he could never explain away, a silent witness recording the truth while he told a different story to everyone around him, including the police. But beneath the courtroom arguments, beneath the forensic testimony and the appeals, there is still Lisa Pattison, a mother, a marketing professional who built a career she was proud of, a woman who, even after suspecting betrayal, chose to try to hold her family together rather than walk away. Her family remembers her that way still, loving, creative, driven, a woman whose life was cut short long before it should have been. Her son, weeks from turning 18 when she died, grew into adulthood without his mother beside him. What this case leaves behind reaches further than a 60-year sentence. It's a reminder that the people closest to us are not always who they appear to be, and that sometimes the smallest piece of digital evidence, a timestamp, a hard drive, a string of text messages, is what finally tells the truth a courtroom cannot reach any other way. But this story was never really about Scott Pattison. It was about Lisa, the life she lived, the son she raised, and the family that continues, all these years later, to carry her memory forward.